So let's talk broadly about whether more stimulus is warranted, given that economic discussion, given the jobs number this morning. Infrastructure spend still warranted?
Well, if I think it was a great jobs report, it's hard to argue that we need more fiscal stimulus at this point. I think that if anything, we need to begin pulling some of it off, not just from a monetary policy perspective, as you suggested, but also, candidly, the continuation of these extraordinarily generous benefits for unemployment, I think, is discouraging. What we could have is even a more healthy labor market at this point. So it's hard to see the real need for the additional fiscal stimulus now.
Even if it is targeted on areas like infrastructure?
Well, I think that's a huge if, because you look at these proposals and they use the broad term of infrastructure, but it's quite euphemistic because it's supporting all sorts of other programs that really aren't roads, bridges, highways. In fact, this latest so-called bipartisan bill is really only 10% of roads, bridges, and highways, and it funds a lot of other goodwill projects that I think are sort of a wish list of many of the most progressive parts of the Democrat Party. So I can see there are plenty of places that in our country that would benefit from infrastructure spending if it was truly targeted for that. But it doesn't seem that any of these legislative efforts so far are really that. It instead seems they know there's a public interest in infrastructure, so we'll call it infrastructure and throw everything under it.
Well, but it also does improve infrastructure. I mean, IMF looked at it, Mark, and put the two bills together and said it'll cumulatively add more than 5 percentage points to GDP and continue to add beyond the next decade a percentage point to GDP, and it will also boost our productivity. Wouldn't you be in favor of pro-growth policies?
If you can get that sort of pro-growth policy, I guess I'm a skeptic on that, particularly if you're going to say that the way to fund that is ultimately trillions of dollars in tax increases that I think would actually begin to spur job loss. I think that one of the benefits previously of the tax relief we had that drove the unemployment to 3.5% was bringing jobs back into America. And if you begin to increase the tax rates, I think you'll begin to push jobs overseas. So, Sarah, of course, those numbers sound rosy. I would be a skeptic on that, and I believe the question is at what cost do you actually get those benefits?
Marc, I wanted to ask about China, end of a week where we've seen some strong words from President Xi, of course, ongoing discussions in all circles about human rights abuses. Do you feel vindicated for the Trump administration's firm stance on China, but at the same time disappointed at not seizing the opportunity you guys created for yourself to clamp down harder? Because I think it's fair to say that China was stronger at the end of your 4 years than they were at the start.
I'm not sure about that. I do think that one of the achievements of the administration, the President Trump, was actually changing the national discourse on China. I think that roughly 30 years ago, in fact, it was the Republican Party in many cases that said, look, if we can extend free markets in China, it's going to lead to all sorts of other reforms. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen the other reforms in China. And in fact, I think you've seen a continued persecution of the Uyghurs and persecution of religious rights. And so I think that President Trump did change the discourse on China. In some ways, has even boxed in the Democrat administration about how they talk about China. So I do think it awakened a lot of Americans to the dangers and the adversary that we have in China.
As you know, Mark, the Trump organization and the CFO have been charged with tax and financial fraud in a case that a lot of people could think that could ultimately bring down the Trump organization. Do you think this will hurt the former president politically or financially?
Sarah, I don't have any insight into the Trump organization's finances. I guess the question, if they're legitimate charges, then of course. But at the same time, if it ends up being that they're going after the CFO in an effort to try to get to the president, and many Americans believe it's more of a political witch hunt, then I would think it would bolster the president. So I don't know how that's going to play out, and candidly, I don't have insight into their internal finances.
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.